Happy birthday, America! Say what you want about her railroads, but deep down, this industry is constantly innovating, as it has been from its inception. Yes, I know, America, as well as the rest of the Americas, is laughably behind the rest of the developed world when it comes to passenger rail travel, but that doesn't mean our country has not turned out inventions that have massively impacted the industry, not just on our home turf, but the rest of the world, especially in the freight sector. We're talking long before precision scheduled railroading was even a thing. I'm the Rocket City Railfan, and in honor of America's 250th birthday, I'm going to be giving the spotlight to the nation's top 10 most prominent inventions in the railroad industry. Now, bear in mind, this is from the perspective of a lifelong train enthusiast getting his foot in the door in the railroad, and who has had the company of all other kinds of railroad professionals, working in the same as well as different fields of the industry. So, I know some railroad professionals would put other kinds of railroad inventions on this list, and some would even call me a foamer. But you know what? I'm not going to take it personally. The railroad is just as much about train tracks as it is trains, the very machines it is made for. This aspect alone is what gets most people into it. You generally cannot have one without the other. We come from all backgrounds and walks of life, just like America's citizens. So, without further ado, after I have just addressed everything I have just said, these are the top 10 American railroad inventions. Number 10. Gondola cars. These are an open-topped rail car, or truck if you're British, mainly used to transport loose materials and unfinished commodities, such as wood chips, gravel, scrap metal, and other raw materials. Because of the low height of their sidewalls, they can also be used for carrying high-density freight, such as steel and coal. Unlike hopper cars, gondolas can't be unloaded from the bottom, meaning they have to be unloaded using machines to lift out their cargo or dump it to the side. That, of course, depends on the type of gondola we're using. Gondola cars, in their earliest form, were just flat cars with wooden sides added, with their origins dating back to the 1830s in North America. They weren't widely used initially because unloading them was slow and dependent on manual labor. That was until advancements in technology, i.e. machines to lift heavy things, made this process more efficient. Here in America nowadays, gondolas are just as much seen on coal trains in the form of high-sided ones, and on other types of freight trains in the form of low-sided ones. Naturally, neighboring Canada and Mexico have also caught on with the concept. Other railways outside of North America have also caught on with the concept of gondola cars. Admittedly, these rail cars aren't seen as much as others, especially on lesser used secondary and branch lines. You usually see these things out on the main line, but their role on railways in the world remains vital nonetheless. Number 9. A lot of steam locomotive wheel arrangements. I'm talking every wheel arrangement of American origin, both exclusive and not exclusive to America. Any foamer could name these, by the way. Now, there are a lot of wheel arrangements we invented, so I'm not gonna yap about all of them because it would take way too long. But I will shed light on some of the more notable ones. That is, once I show you a list of this. The first thing many people who don't live in North America find out about American steam locomotives is that they are absolutely enormous. It's so widespread that it's a meme. The only massive wheel arrangements that America, and indeed the rest of North America, did not invent were the Garrett types, seen on every other populated continent. A lot of countries would follow in our steps with wheel arrangements such as the 462 Pacific in the years to come. The Pennsylvania Railroad's A4 Pacifics heavily inspired the boiler design of Sir Nigel Gresley's A1 Pacifics of the Great Northern Railway, later the London and Northeastern Railway of the United Kingdom, which in turn later evolved into the souped-up A3s. And even though the title for the most famous steam locomotive is rightfully held by the Flying Scotsman, which is a British 462 Pacific by the way, other wheel arrangements in the United States have went on to become iconic in their own rights. The locomotive in the world-famous Christmas book, The Polar Express, and 2004 film of the same name, is a 284 Berkshire from the Pierre Marquette Railway, specifically locomotive number 1225. The 282 Mikado type was one of the most mass-produced and universal in the United States. It's equally iconic in Japan, which is also where the name Mikado came from, mainly in the form of the country's most mass-produced steam locomotives, the Japanese National Railway D51s. The Northern Pacific Railroad both invented and named the 484 Northern and 2884 Yellowstone types. The former would go on to become the zenith of widespread U.S. mixed traffic and passenger-oriented steam locomotives, and the latter became the largest to ever expand outside of the United States. Even if it was into, of all places, the Soviet Union, i.e. America's biggest political enemy at the time at which this happened. Some 2884s, particularly those of the Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range Railroad, and the Northern Pacific Railroad, even outperformed the Union Pacific's big boys in tractive effort and tonnage. Speaking of which, the long-forgotten Northern Pacific locomotives even hold 2 world records. One, for the highest tractive effort of a simple articulated steam locomotive, and 2, the largest firebox ever used on a steam locomotive. It was so big they were even able to hold a feast in it while the boiler was under construction. Then you have US exclusives, such as the Union Pacific's 412-9000s, the largest 3-cylinder rigid frame locomotives, and largest successful non-articulated locomotives not of a duplex design, and the true largest/longest rigid frame locomotive in the form of the Pennsylvania Railroad's S1. When it comes to articulated locomotives, you have the 4664 Challenger, the most widespread, large articulated steam locomotive in the country. And unintentionally the largest mixed traffic steam locomotive ever created, courtesy of Union Pacific. Not only because they co-invented the thing, but also because they were the first ones to ever even use Challengers in dedicated passenger service. Hence why they're called the unintentionally largest mixed traffic steam locomotives in the world. Then there's the most iconic of them, the Union Pacific's 4884 Big Boys, the largest and heaviest reciprocating steam locomotives ever built, the true king of steam. It's been claimed that just one of these mammoth machines could pull a loaded freight train 5 miles long on level track. Whether that was true or not, these things were still a force to be reckoned with. Just one big boy puts even modern diesel locomotives to shame. Why did I just say that? Well, the longest train that a big boy can pull at speed would need 2 to 3 modern diesels, maybe even a 4th. And also because this is America, electric locomotives are not much of a thing here because it's complicated. But anyway, back in the 1940s and 1950s, Union Pacific would have needed 5 to 6 diesels just to match that same outcome. Because not only were the trains so long, but they were also traveling over steep gradients, i.e. Sherman Hill and the Wasatch Mountains. Okay, I could go on and on about American locomotive wheel arrangements, but that would have to be a separate video. I think you can see now why I predicted that so many industry professionals in the audience would start calling me a foamer at this point. Because I was yapping about things that foamers regularly speak about. Anyway, number 8. Tank cars. These horizontal cylindrical shaped rail cars are quite a common sight on all sorts of freight trains and are used to transport liquid and gaseous commodities. The concept was patented by Brooklyn inventor Samuel J. Seeley in 1863 as an improved rail car for transporting petroleum. Speaking of which, the tank itself was horizontal and parallel to the track. And ever since then, the basic concept has remained the same. That being said, the tanks were originally made of wood before this was replaced with wrought iron, and later steel further down the line as this technology was developed. Over the years, many versions of tank cars have been developed for transporting wide varieties of liquid and gaseous commodities, from chemicals to food products to gas and oil. That includes hazardous materials, or hazmats, of all categories. Tank cars can be pressurized, insulated, and designed for multiple or single commodities depending on their owner's needs. Specialized tank cars have even been developed in and outside of North America for transporting milk and other odd commodities. Plus, specialized tank containers designed for intermodal transportation are also a thing in North America to further allow trains to compete with trucking and ships. These rail cars are also dangerous when transporting flammable and/or hazardous materials, so if something goes wrong with them, it will go really wrong. It is not just the fires from their cargo that can burn for a couple hours, they've even, on rare occasions, suffered BLEVs, or boiling liquid expanding vapor explosions. Thankfully though, accidents like this are very rare compared to trucking equivalents, and transporting hazmats and flammable commodities is generally safer by rail anyway. Number 7. Refrigerated rail cars. Also known as reefers, these are refrigerated boxcars used for transporting perishable freight, such as fruits, vegetables, meat, and potatoes at specific temperatures. They can be cooled using ice, CO2, liquid nitrogen, or mechanical cooling. It all began in 1842, when the Western Railroad of Massachusetts, later the Boston and Albany Railroad, was reported to be experimenting with a freight car capable of carrying all types of perishable goods without spoilage. That being said, the first reefer didn't enter service until 1851 on the Northern Railroad, that is, of New York State, later the Ogdensburg division of the Rutland Railroad, and it was only functional in cold weather. Though, like many technologies, this was improved and perfected over the years. Soon enough, the number of these rail cars in service in America rose from over 1,300 in 1880 to 68,500 in 1900. Over time, ice-cooled cars were replaced with mechanically cooled cars beginning in the latter half of the 20th century, along with the armies of personnel needed to re-ice them. They have also been used in Japan and in the UK, although the former doesn't use them anymore, in favor of reefer containers, while the latter continues to do so, albeit in the form of intermodal transportation as opposed to refrigerated boxcars. Over here in America, refrigerated rail transport is still used nationwide, both in the forms of actual refrigerated rail cars and in intermodal transportation. The latter comes in the form of refrigerated truck trailers transported by rail on flat cars designed for this purpose, and have containers that have cooling built into them, and can be double stacked in intermodal rail cars. From 2001 to 2005, the number of reefers jumped from a low of 8,000 to 25,000. Number 6. Track circuits. Over the years, railroads have developed signal systems used to separate trains so that they don't, bump into each other. Signals are the railroad equivalent of traffic lights used by road vehicles. They tell the locomotive engineer, or driver depending on the country, whether to stop, slow down, or proceed. They used to be operated manually, but nowadays they are generally operated semi-automatically. The heart of what allows this to happen are electrical systems called track circuits. They make up a section of track, known as a block, and are used to determine whether a train is in the block or not. The way these things are set up is that power is supplied at each end of a section of track, aka the block. A relay coil is wired between the two rails at each end to complete the circuit. When a vehicle isn't occupying the block, the circuit is complete. In other words, electricity is flowing through it in a continuous loop. So the following signal aspect displayed is green. Now when a vehicle enters the block, the steel wheels and axles shunt the rails together, in other words, breaking the circuit, i.e. de-energizing it and causing the relay contacts to drop and automatically display a red signal aspect, meaning that a train is in the block and others have to stop until it exits the block. Now, that's just the basics. Railroad signal systems are a massive rabbit hole that I am in no way qualified to even talk about as a professional in depth. And that's not my field of expertise. Anyway, I think by the channel content I make, you clearly can tell where my expertise is. Now, they also have to be set up to display yellow and flashing yellow aspects as well for other scenarios. Speaking of which, signals can even turn off when a train isn't even in the block to save electricity, only to turn on again when one is coming. The aspect will depend on the direction said train is coming. but the basic principle of track circuits remain the same, especially in America. That being said, they are set up differently for electrified lines, which we don't really have much of in North America anymore. That and the fact that we would have had more if the Milwaukee Road never tore down the wires of its Pacific extension, because they were that mismanaged. And RIP that line too, which was also another victim of their mismanagement as well. Anyway, number 5, defect detectors. If you've spent sufficient time railfanning in North America, you've probably heard something like this over a radio frequency. Well, if you do have a radio to begin with.
UP detector, milepost 443.6, no defects. Total axle 392, train speed 38 mph, temperature 41 degrees, detector out.
That is a defect detector, an automated wayside device used to detect problems with trains and the tracks they traverse. If we're going to be really technical, the earliest forms of these things were infrared sensors for hotboxes, which happen when a journal box on an axle overheats. Before these were even a thing starting in the 1940s, railroad employees themselves were responsible for detecting problems with the trains and the tracks, from trackside workers to the train crews themselves, including the train engineer. By the mid-20th century, America's railroads were increasingly using large-scale mainframe computers to manage the growing complexity of their networks and operations, not to mention growing tonnage, in spite of a shrinking national share, thanks to outdated overregulation from the Interstate Commerce Commission, coupled with trucking competition. With this progress came the very first computerized defect detectors, which had lights indicating the nature of the defect, as well as a numeric display with the associated axle number. The Seaboard Airline was the first railroad to implement defect detectors in the form this generation knows today, that speaks the results to train crews and trackside employees over radios, in the same pattern that we're familiar with today. They did this around 1960, with the first being installed in Riceboro, Georgia, on the Everett subdivision, just 7 years before the railroad merged with the Atlantic Coast Line to form the Seaboard Coast Line, or SCL, in 1967. Unfortunately for rail enthusiasts, if you're that interested in defect detectors, in 1985, this subdivision was abandoned by SCL's successor, CSX, who took up the track south of Riceboro to Seals, Florida the following year. Defect detectors in this form have since become industry standards, long before freight rail operations were even computerized in the 1990s. The railroad industry has increasingly incorporated computers into these machines to generate more detailed and accurate reports of train status. Modern systems even use computer programs with the assistance of AI, or artificial intelligence, to analyze photographs and identify potential errors for review by humans. And trust me, this is actually helpful AI, not the garbage AI, which is so not welcome in the content creation world. And that's different AI, too, from, well, what the railroads are using for analyzing defects, so yeah. Several forms of defect detectors have emerged over the years. Hotbox detectors measure the temperatures above ambient of every journal bearing of a passing train. Dragging equipment detectors detect anything dragging under a passing train. And wheel impact detectors detect flat spots that are too dangerous for the associated wheel to continue traveling. For those not in the know, when a wheel has a flat spot, it makes a big clunking sound every time said flat spot makes contact with the rail. You'll know if there's a flat spot if the passing wheel sets are noisier than they usually are. Like this example. And those are just a handful of examples of defect detectors that have been developed to detect any defect out on the line that can't be seen from public spaces. Either way, these things are very important in allowing safe railroad operations, all whilst allowing most of the work to be performed by the computers in even the most remote locations, and allow the humans to take care of the rest. To say they've reduced national accident rates would be an understatement, so long as you're actually using them sufficiently and correctly. Number 4. Shay locomotives. Now it is time for us foamers in the audience to really have some fun. Shays are a type of geared steam locomotive that use multiple smaller cylinders to turn a jointed shaft, stretching the length of the locomotive to turn the wheels using gears on the right side of said wheel sets. They, along with other geared steam locomotive types, are not your average steam locomotive, which usually has two outside cylinders to turn the wheels using connected rods. And unlike your average steam locomotive, you'd never find these locomotives thundering out on the main line. You'd find them in industrial settings, mainly logging and mining. The Shay locomotive was invented by Ephraim Shay, a Civil War veteran and school teacher turned logger and inventor in either 1876 or 1877. After building his own 2-foot 2-inch gauge tramway as a better way than to use snow sleds to move logs to his sawmill in Michigan, he came up with the idea to take a flat car, mount a boiler to it, and connect it to the trucks. Initially, he used a chain drive to power the axles, which did not work. So then he came up with the idea of having the wheels driven by gear shafts connected to vertical cylinders and pistons all mounted on the right side of the locomotive, which not only worked, but became popular pretty quickly. Eventually, the Lima Locomotive Works in Lima, Ohio was contracted to build Shay's prototype, which they did in 1880. After that, it was not long until the concept became popular with logging and industrial railroads. So much so that the success led to the expansion and reorganization of the Lima Locomotive Works, and by 1902, Lima went from just being another unnoticeable manufacturer to one of the 3 prime locomotive manufacturers in the United States, second only to the American Locomotive Company based in Schenectady, New York, and the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Other versions of Shay and Lima's designs also emerged after the patents expired. Shays, as well as other geared steam locomotives, are very slow, but make up for it with incredibly high tractive effort for locomotives of their size, whilst being able to traverse lightly laid rails. Even with loaded trains in tow, they can tackle much steeper gradients than conventional steam locomotives, which usually cannot manage gradients steeper than 2%, or 3% in the case of some railroads. To give an example, the Cass Scenic Railroad in West Virginia, which is known for having shays, has gradients upwards of 9%, compared to the 2.2% grades of California's Cajon Pass and the 3% grade of New Mexico's Raton Pass, the steepest active standard gauge main lines in America. And if you want to count the narrow gauge Cumbres Pass, at least in its current form, that reaches upwards of 4%. Still less than half of Cass's 9%. Shay locomotives aren't just an American exclusive either. Though most were built for use in the United States, many were exported to about 30 countries by either Lima firsthand or secondhand from American railroads. And they came in many gauges, including global standard gauge, North American narrow gauge, and other continents' versions of narrow gauge. Out of the approximately 2,770 shays that Lima ever built, an impressive 116 survive in museums, parks, and heritage railroads all over the world, from static display to being fully operational. And that includes all the shays that are operational at the Cass Scenic Railroad. I haven't been there myself, but I would highly recommend you visit that railroad, especially if you're a fan of shays, or just any geared steam locomotive. Number 3. Superpower steam locomotives. Speaking of Lima Locomotive Works, the Shay locomotives certainly put them on Alco and Baldwin's radars, but we also cannot forget about Superpower, because this is when Lima began to give these two a run for their money. Lima invented the concept and term of superpower, which is officially defined as a steam locomotive with a booster-equipped 4-wheel trailing truck under a larger firebox, as well as enlarged superheaters. Now, in general, train enthusiasts boil superpower down to just 4-wheel trailing trucks for simplicity's sake, because, well, we do that basically all the time with anyone that doesn't know anything about steam locomotives, or, well, trains. With railroads looking to make freight trains faster beginning in the 1920s, the solution that most turned to was getting locomotives that were able to handle pulling at least the same tonnage, but at higher speed, completing the journey in a shorter amount of time. In 1922, the New York Central requested William Woodard, Lima's vice president of engineering, to design a modern freight locomotive more efficient than their existing Mikados, specifically for one of their subsidiaries, the Boston and Albany Railroad. Woodard initially turned out the H-10, which in its design was an improved version of the H-7E Mikados with almost double the heating surface in the firebox, among other modifications. Soon in, Woodard realized that in order to satisfy New York Central's needs, he would have to double the size of the firebox. So to compensate for the increased size of the axle load for making the firebox that much bigger, and therefore heavier, and therefore much harder on the rails, he solved the issue by fitting his follow-up design with a 4-wheel trailing truck instead of a 2-wheeled one. The resulting demonstrator locomotive of this design was turned out in 1925 and was the first true 284 tender locomotive. It was known as the A1 and was immediately tested on the Boston and Albany, who quickly found favor with the design for its improvements, mainly its ability to outpace even the H10s with the same tonnage. Soon enough, they had taken delivery of 45 copies from 1926 to 1930. The 284 type became known as the Berkshire after the Berkshire Mountains in the United States. Other railroads soon found out and began taking orders of their own superpower locomotives in all sorts of wheel arrangements for passenger and freight service. Alco and Baldwin, not to be outdone in the locomotive market, also joined the bandwagon. 462 Pacifics became 464 Hudsons, 282 Mikados into 284 Berkshires, 482 Mountains into 484 Northerns, 210-2 Santa Fe's into 210-4 Texas types, and so on. Other countries were quick to follow suit with their own tender locomotives built with 4-wheel trailing trucks. The superpower development reached its peak and limits in 1941, with the 2 heaviest reciprocating steam locomotives ever built. The Lima-built 2666 Alleghenies of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, and the Alco-built 4884 Big Boys of the Union Pacific. The latter locomotives are what hold the title for the largest reciprocating steam locomotives ever built, and the true king of steam. Well, at least when you consider the build dates, the metal used per batch, as well as the additional weight of the tender and all that. But the tender is, well, separate from the locomotive. It really only rides behind there because of fuel, you know? Otherwise it would just been a tank engine with very short range. Anyway, dozens of superpower locomotives are preserved, not just in America, but in many other countries too. Of those include 8 of the Union Pacific Big Boys, several dozen Northerns, and 20 Berkshires. If Berkshires already sound familiar to you and the rest of the general public, it's because of Pierre Marquette number 1225. That locomotive is most famous for being the inspiration of the 1985 book The Polar Express, and for featuring as the locomotive in the 2004 classic Christmas film adaptation of the same name. Admittedly, America did not build the first 284 locomotive, only the first tender version. The first 284 ever made was a tank engine version built in Australia, in the form of the Western Australian Railway Government K-class locomotives, which, by the way, were also 3 foot 6 inch gauge locomotives, not 4 feet 8.5 inches like the rest of the world, including the majority of American railroads, and, well, with that, Pierre Marquette 1225. The first 210-4 was not a true 210-4, as it was a Santa Fe Railway 3800 class 210-2 locomotive built with a 4-wheel trailing truck squeezed under its firebox in place of the normal 2-wheel truck used by the rest of its class. The first true purpose-built 210-4 wasn't actually built until 1925 in the form of the Texas and Pacific's I-1s, which of course were influenced by both the 210-2 and 284 simultaneously this time. It was the I-1s and subsequent later editions of the class where the name Texas came from for the 210-4, after their owner, the Texas and Pacific, since these locomotives were the first true 210-4 locomotives ever built. Also, yes, I'm aware that if you're Canadian, you don't call these locomotives Texas types, rather you call them Selkirks, after the Selkirk Mountains. Okay, I don't mean to brag. I'm just gonna state the truth here. America does not screw around with big locomotives and really long trains. Our railroad professionals are natural experts in keeping humongously long trains on the move, and big locomotives are often how they solve that, especially back in the days of steam. Not to say that America is not the only country that screws around with big trains or big locomotives. Just look what Australia does on a regular basis. Because they too do some pretty epic things like we do in America. Number 2. Simple articulated steam locomotives. And I am not screwing around giving the spotlight to examples of moving mammoth trains. Simple articulated steam locomotives are an American development of the Mallet articulated design, invented by Swiss engineer Anatole Mallet in the late 1880s. An articulated steam locomotive is a steam locomotive with 2 engine frames that move independently of each other on curves using hinges. A Mallet is a type of articulated steam locomotive where the 2 engine units are joined to each other by a hinge pin. In this setup, only the rear engine unit is connected to the boiler, allowing the front unit to swing out from under the boiler on curves, whilst it and the rear engine unit follow it through said curve. Thus, the locomotive can traverse tighter turns that rigid frame locomotives with the same number of driving wheels can't, without derailing. See the AA-20 locomotive and you'll know what I mean. When the throttle of a Mallet is opened by the locomotive engineer/driver, the steam first enters the rear high-pressure cylinders to push the pistons back and forth. Then the steam is sent to the larger, low-pressure cylinders on the front unit for the same purpose, before it is exhausted out of the locomotive smokestack. Naturally, American railroads gave the Mallet a shot once they got word of it. A few, such as the Norfolk and Western, even committed to it long-term, and they really did make a massive impact on freight rail transportation here. But by the 1920s, most of these railroads were having a lot of problems with Mallet articulateds. Mainly they were slow, they produced massive hammer blow on the track, had adhesion stability problems above walking pace that made the front engine unit prone to wheel slip, and even the massive American loading gauge was limiting the size of the low pressure cylinders. At the same time, high speeds were being more expected of freight trains to meet national demand. In other words, freight trains were turning from slow, heavy drags to fast freights, which is already why superpower locomotives were even invented. In order to fix most, if not all of these problems with the Mallet articulated that made it so slow, and generally problematic for a lot of railroads, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad introduced the H7, a locomotive of which the design simplified the whole compound Mallet mechanics. Instead of two sets of cylinders of different sizes, all four of them were the same size, and done away was the whole compounding in favor of having the steam flow into all four cylinders simultaneously, directly from the open throttle. 25 examples were turned out by the American Locomotive Company in 1923 and 24, followed by 20 more locomotives from Baldwin in 1926. They were still hinged in the same manner as true Mallets. This divergence from the true Mallet concept came to be known as the simple articulated, for it was a simpler mechanical design. It proved much more popular with American railroads, such as the Northern Pacific, Southern Pacific, Clinchfield, and everyone's favorite owner of Big Steam, the Union Pacific. Examples of simple articulateds include, and are not limited to, all 4664 Challenger locomotives, all 2884 Yellowstone locomotives, the Norfolk and Western's A-Class 2664s, and of course, the Union Pacific Big Boys, the true king of the steam locomotives. Now, simple articulateds were not as powerful as true Mallets when it came to tractive effort. This was especially the case with ones fitted with larger diameter driving wheels. But they made up for it in speed, specifically having a more perfect balance between speed and power. This meant they could pull really long trains, whilst also being able to do so at higher speeds of 30 to 60 miles an hour, something that true Mallets were nowhere near as capable of. And the tractive effort of simple articulated locomotives was still menacing. Some were even used on the head ends of extra long passenger, mail, and troop trains on occasion, especially during World War II. Union Pacific even repainted 10 Challengers in their Greyhound livery for passenger service between Portland, Oregon and Seattle, Washington from 1946 to 1952. Under the control of their skilled crews, simple articulated locomotives were muscling massive hotshot freight trains at high speed all over the United States till the very end of steam. In the Appalachian Mountains in the east, across the Great Plains in the Midwest, through the Rockies, deserts, and tundras in the west, and over Sherman Hill in Wyoming, as well as many more places, long before intermodal trains were even a thing. The big boys were among the last to be retired, which came as late as 1962. Several simple articulated steam locomotives are now left in the United States, including 2 Challengers and 8 big boys. Wait a minute, something was on my mind a bit earlier before I said that. Oh, I know where this is going now. And number 1.
Double stack container trains.
Finally, something many of us Americans see in our areas of the country every day, and one you really ought not to take for granted. Double-stacked container trains are a form of intermodal transportation consisting of intermodal shipping containers double-stacked on rail cars specifically designed for this one purpose. So many items that were once shipped across the country in boxcars now travel by rail in these container trains. With trucking competition leeching cargo from America's railroads beginning in the 1930s, industry professionals began developing ways to not only better compete with it, but also take back that traffic, which was always making these railroads so much money. It started with a trailer on flat car, or piggyback service, in the 1950s, which was also in the same decade that a new standardized steel intermodal container, based on specifications from the United States Department of Defense, began to revolutionize freight transportation. It was also in that same time frame that the narrow-gauge White Pass and Yukon route introduced the world's first container ship, the Clifford J. Rogers, in 1955, followed by containers for its isolated railway route between Skagway, Alaska, and Whitehorse, Yukon. Yep, you heard me. A narrow-gauge railroad of all railroads became the first railroad to use container trains in the United States. Come the 1960s, and the use of containers steadily increased in America, which may have also been what led to the Southern Pacific Railroad and Robert Ingram of the American shipping company Sealand to debut the first double-stacked intermodal railcar in 1977, jointly designed with AFC Industries. Like any new technology, this was slow to become an industry standard. It wasn't until 1984 that double-stacked trains started becoming common here, beginning with a shipment by American President lines from Los Angeles, California to South Kearney, New Jersey, starting on the Union Pacific Railroad, then transferring to the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, and then to Conrail, who brought the shipment to its final destination. Double-stacked intermodal trains have made up a massive chunk of U.S. rail traffic. So, why do these railroads double-stack containers? For one thing, by stacking 2 containers aboard each railcar, you only need half as many of these railcars, therefore cutting the consist in half without even exceeding weight restrictions. It therefore makes these container trains, which are already miles more efficient and cost-effective than trucks, even more efficient. And if you ever wonder how these containers don't even move, they have load-bearing points spaced accordingly so that all lengths can be stacked atop of each other without compatibility issues. At these load-bearing points are coupling holes, which are female and double male twist locks, used to securely mate container stacks together. Now, the only drawback to double stacking is clearance issues, specifically at bridges and tunnels too low to allow double-stacked containers to pass through, which, as you can imagine, has resulted in America's railroads having to implement improvement projects to amend the issue. Said railroad has to either remove the obstruction, cut a notch to solve the issue, and/or lower the track bed. But this one drawback is heavily outweighed by the benefits. And if that's not a relief to you yet, I sure hope it is now. Because just a single 100-car double-stacked train is enough to remove 200 semi-trucks from America's congested interstate highways. These are the fastest freight trains riding North America's rails today, from the eastern seaboard to the west coast and from north to south, over the Appalachian Mountains, the Great Plains, and the Rockies, in all weather conditions too. Well, at least on the main lines of Class 1 railroads. To say that this one innovation gave railroads in the 1980s a much-needed leverage over other transportation modes would be an understatement. After all, they had suffered dreadfully from outdated overregulation from the Interstate Commerce Commission, only for the 1980 Staggers Act to heavily lift those outdated regulations that almost killed the industry, allowing it to recover and readapt like never before. And just like that, it recovered into a prospering industry again that remains an irreplaceable asset that the American economy cannot function without. Sorry, truckers, it's truth. This one system is miles more efficient than anything you ever use. Do you know any other railroad inventions of American origin? If so, drop them in the comments below. Happy 250th birthday, America. Without your railroads, you wouldn't be functional nor be the most economically developed country and powerhouse on the face of the earth. Remember, your railroads were the ones who opened you up in the first place, not the interstate highways. The railroads were there long beforehand. Sorry, motorheads. I'm just telling you the truth from our history books. Not many Americans even realize that it was actually the railroads that opened up the country, nor take that to heart as much as they should in this day and age. Look, I know that America is not perfect, and she is not a sinless country, even countries whose roots are in God's holy word. The United States of America will always have problems, and always has from the very beginning, and we've always wrestled with God. But you know what? I'm not gonna let that define who I am in the eyes of the Lord God Almighty. And I'm happy to say that we do our best to be open and honest about our problems, just like we as people on this earth should be open and honest, because our Creator, the Lord God Almighty, knows everything, and because He can read our minds. That is a power that we as humans do not have on this earth. And my biggest hope that my decision to invite God into this video can show you that by the seeds that I plant to you, the audience. Thank you so much for watching, regardless of what country you're from. I'm the Rocket City Railfan, and to all my fellow American citizens, be it you were born here or from another country, and whatever state you're from, be it Colorado, California, Texas, Alabama, New York, Nebraska, Kansas, or even Alaska and Hawaii, you name it, I wish you all a very happy 250th Independence Day, and may the Lord God Almighty be with you all. Thanks for watching.